And good morning to everybody. Welcome to the Krueg Show. Larry Krueger joined by Chase Sr. on this Friday, November the 3rd, 10:51 on the West Coast, 1:51 on the East Coast. Hope everybody's having a phenomenal day. Niners in the bye week. We got a lot to get to. Chase, good to see you, man. How are you?
You as well, running it back from last week. Really enjoyed it, and I know we got some good feedback from the audience, so hopefully we can keep that good momentum going.
Well, you know, we talked about a number of different options last week, and I don't know that trade options. And I don't know that we ever really singled in on Chase Young, but the man who you share a name with is now a 49er. And give me your thoughts on it. I mean, the price seemed right. In some ways, I'm shocked that a guy who was the second pick overall didn't have more of a market, or maybe he did. And Martin Mayhew and John Lynch have a tight relationship. I'm not sure how this happened, but the Niners got, I think, a real upgrade, and they got it for a very paltry price.
I agree. Yeah, I talked about Chase Young a couple of times on my show just because I thought there was a possibility that the Commanders were going to kind of free fall a little bit. I don't love their coaching staff. I didn't like the start that they got off to. I know that they had stacked up some wins, but some of those wins were fraudulent. And when they went up against good teams, they really, really struggled. So I wasn't expecting Chase Young to be the guy as we inch closer toward the deadline, but I did see it as a realistic scenario. And when you kind of compare him and Montez Sweat, I think Chase Young has more upside. Montez Sweat has been able to stay a little bit healthier, but I think that the Niners knocked it out of the park as far as the value here, because if you look at what the Bears gave up for Montez Sweat, they're going to have to sign him to a contract extension. They sent Washington an early second-round pick. The Niners are giving up a third-round compensatory pick that's most likely going to fall between 80 and 90. And then if Chase Young ends up leaving and he's just a rental and San Francisco doesn't re-sign him, then they're able to get that third-round pick back. So then it's a wash at that point. And I think with San Francisco, I was looking for them to address the secondary because I do believe that that's a little bit of an issue. But I think that San Francisco kind of looked at the roster. They looked at some film. They surveyed this team going 5-3 into the bye week. And I think that they look at their evaluations as such. If the defensive line can get home and Chase Young is going to help that, then the secondary is going to have an easier job of holding up in coverage. Because of San Francisco's inability to consistently get after the quarterback, that's what's led to the secondary being a little bit exposed. So if those pressures and quarterback hits actually turn into sacks, and now that you have Chase Young, 5 sacks, really good player, an elite athlete when he can stay healthy, I think it's going to cure some things on the back end and in turn help out this pass rush and in that secondary.
You know, Young's got 5 sacks. He's got a 25% pass rush win rate off the edge. That's higher than his amazing rookie year where he was the defensive rookie of the year.
Yep.
Add in the fact that he's joining a star-studded defensive line. Man, the Niners really upgraded. And yet there seems to be kind of a contradiction as far as, difference of opinions on Chase Young. Is he – some people would say – he's returned to the player he was as a rookie. Other people would say he's just a distant memory from that player. I mean, where do you grade him out as a player? I know he was wearing the big brace, so we kind of can see that. But his numbers look good this year on a really, he's coming off of a really good Commander line to join a really good 49er line that's, I think, kind of underachieving thus far. How much has he lost since the surgery?
Well, that was a pretty invasive knee surgery, and it took him so long to come back from that. And I know there were some rumblings coming out of Washington and that organization that he would kind of freestyle on a couple of plays. He wasn't really well liked in that locker room, and it took him a little bit too long to come off that knee injury. Look, when you're a young player of that caliber and you suffer an ACL injury with some other stuff in that knee, take your time with that recovery. Clearly, he wasn't feeling himself, right? Clearly, he understood that projecting forward, he had an opportunity to secure the bag if he was able to play really well this year, and he's going to have an opportunity to do that. He's off to a really good start with Washington. In the 2 full seasons that he's played, rookie year when he was the defensive player of the year, and so far this year, he has been a really, really good edge rusher and a physical freak. him and Nick Bosa at Ohio State, it's really unfortunate that we didn't get to see them play a full season together because Bosa went down with that core muscle injury. But Bosa went number 2 in 2019. Chase Young went number 2 in 2020. There are reasons why those players went that high in the draft, because they have a pass rush arsenal that's really, really elite. And I think what's an under talked about storyline right now, we talk about the pass rush, and it's been a problem because that front end is not tied to the back end. And because of that, the secondary has gotten a little bit leaky, and San Francisco is investing all this money in that defensive front. And so far, they've been disappointing. They have 18 sacks as a team. That's tied for 18th in the NFL, but their run defense has been really, really bad. And it kind of started to get exposed against the Cleveland Browns when Dre Greenlaw was out. Since that moment, though, Browns, Vikings, Bengals, worst of all, last week when Joe Mixon ran crazy, this Niners rushing defense has not been good. They can't set the edge. We think about Chase Young as a really good pass rusher, and he is. He's actually a really highly graded run defender, too. And when he does set that edge, he's a really impactful player against the rush. So I think this helps you in getting after the quarterback with your pass defense, but it also helps your rushing defense, too, which is an area that San Francisco needs to shore up.
Yeah, before we get to the run D, because the run D has definitely been a major problem, and everybody's blaming Steve Wilks. And, is Steve Wilks the problem? Is Steve Wilks the reason that Fred Warner's missing tackles? Is Steve Wilks the reason that Dre Greenlaw's missing tackles? One thing I thought was interesting is that, I talked to Chris Kasarik in July, and I said, Chris, you got an awesome number one D line, but you lost some of your quality depth. Are you going to run your number ones at a higher rate this year, or are you going to try to rotate them in the same pattern? And he's like, nope, I'm going to rotate him in the same pattern. And you know why? Because if I play Bosa 70 snaps a week, he won't make it to the playoffs. We want to contend for a Super Bowl. We got to make sure that he's not playing, 65, 70 snaps a game. Well, last week against Cincinnati, Bosa played 68 snaps. And I was looking at his usage rate. He's played 60 snaps or more in 4 games this year. The Ram game, Cleveland, Minnesota, and Cincinnati. So, in other words, the Ram game and then the last 3 weeks, he's played 60 or more snaps, his season high being last week. So, the Niners, they were starting to do what they said they didn't want to do, which was try to run Bosa out there more out of desperation. So, in a lot of ways, I'm shocked that in this league where it seems like everybody knows everybody and there are no secrets, that the 49ers could get Chase Young for a 3rd-round pick, seeing that other teams surely could do some quick math and see that the 49ers had a severe need there. But for whatever reason, I don't know if there weren't a lot of bidders because he's got a big contract at the end of the year, or there aren't a lot of teams in contention. But I just thought that a compensatory 3rd seemed really low for a Niner team that Chase seemed somewhat desperate to add this player.
Yeah, and I remember you talking about that during training camp, about the lack of defensive line depth, and that's something that I was concerned about too. You look at that front line and that starting 4, and they're really, really talented, and there's no excuse for why they should be playing as poorly as they are, regardless of scheme or not. At some point, you have to hold the players accountable for doing their job. But why I also like this trade is that it does bulk up your depth a little bit. And I think that Cleveland Ferrell has actually been an underrated player this year. I think he's been a pretty impactful rotational defensive end who can kind of be used in that Charles Omenihu, Arden Key type of role where he can slide on the interior, but also play outside defensive end as well. And I want to continue to see him utilized in that way. I'm not sure what the heck is going on with Drake Jackson. 3 sacks week 1, nothing since then. He's getting outsnapped by Randy Gregory. The talent seems to be there as far as him being an athlete, but there has to be something going on like behind the scenes, right? Where he's just not working hard. There was rumblings of that last year. And because of that, maybe he's lost the trust of this coaching staff a little bit. But look, now you have depth pieces that includes Chase Young, Cleveland Ferrell, Drake Jackson, and Randy Gregory. So now you're able to shore up the depth. You're able to bulk up that starting 4. And I hope we see what Steve Wilkes was kind of flirting with doing throughout training camp. Some of those bear fronts, Larry, you go 5-man front, and then that takes away the opportunity for the opposing offensive line to double team a Nick Bosa, double team a Javon Hargrave, which is what they've done to a certain degree this year, which is a part of the reason why this Niners pass rush has been struggling and unable to get home.
And the price was right. I read a thing yesterday that the Niners are paying combined for Chase Young and Randy Gregory like $1.2 million or $1.4 million. So,
yeah,
there was a lot of people that were like, hey, man, don't go for the trade at the deadline. Roll that money over into next year, pay Aiyuk, extend your core. Well, essentially, they did both, right? They acquired some help that they needed up front, and they also still have $39 million or whatever plus to roll over into next year. How much of a problem is it in your mind, Chase, that the Niners didn't address the secondary?
I think it becomes an issue if the pass rush struggles continue. And everything is really tied from that first level of the defense to the third level of the defense. And I think that the Niners' lack of consistent pass rush has led to Charvarius Mooney-Ward, Diamador Lenore, and Isaiah Oliver being left on an island. And if you think about it, by running some of these twists, by running some of these stunts that Richard Sherman called out on his podcast this week, he was asked what changes he would make. He would say, I'm going back to what has made this defense one of the best in the NFL since 2019 under Robert Saleh, and then D'Amico Ryans after that. 4-man front, one-on-one matchups, let them win those matchups. And if you think about it, in swimming, people like shave their arm hair and their leg hair, right, to take off a millisecond off that time. If you're running these twists and these stunts, Nick Bosa has missed out on a couple of sacks by milliseconds, right? Joe Burrow last week was getting the ball out just in time as Nick Bosa was about to corral him, right? If you stop running some of those twists and you stop running some of those stunts and you just go one-on-one, which is what D'Amico Ryans did a lot, Robert Saleh did a lot, then maybe they're able to win some of those matchups, sack the quarterback, and then the coverage on that back end isn't going to have to hold up as long. So I do think that the struggles in that secondary are tied to the defensive front. I would have loved a Jalen Johnson. And with San Francisco having draft capital, with them having the most cap space in the NFL, he requested a trade. He wanted out of Chicago. I would have gone and got him. That was priority number one for me. You settle for Chase Young. Clearly, San Francisco, in their evaluations, as I said earlier, they think that everything can be solved if they just get to the quarterback. And it can. But if they can't, and these defensive struggles can continue, then that secondary is going to continue to struggle. I do think that some of these answers lie within this organization right now. I think that you have to bench Isaiah Oliver. I know a lot of people have said, Chase, he makes really good tackles against the run. Against the Bengals, he had a couple of TFLs where he set the edge. That's cool. He is a cornerback. He is terrible in coverage. In the last 4 games, he has allowed a completion percentage of 100%. 8 targets, 8 catches, 2 touchdowns, and for this season, he is the second lowest graded cornerback in the NFL, giving up a completion percentage of about 86%. So if you take him off the field and maybe you replace him with the Jair Brown, you have the returns looming, hopefully, of a Samuel Womack, a Darrell Luter Jr., who when they were playing in college at Toledo, South Alabama, they had a knack and they had the instinctual element to their game of making plays on the football. Now, you can play them in the slot. You can put Jair Brown in the slot. He did that at Penn State. He was a very versatile safety. Or if you want Diamador Lenore, who's been a great draft story for San Francisco, getting him in the 5th round out of Oregon, as some of those day 2, day 3 picks continue to reap big dividends for this organization as far as value. If you want to keep him on the outside, you can. If you want to line him up on the inside, I think that his lack of height is better suited out of that slot. There are a couple of different things that you can do to solve this defense. See if they can win their one-on-one matchups and just bull rush. Maybe go with the bear front from time to time. That's 5 defensive linemen. And then take Isaiah Oliver off the field because he has continued to be the lone weakness that the opposing offense continues to target. You just have to make that adjustment.
Yeah, no, you hate to point fingers at one guy in a team sport, but I think you're absolutely right on. I think that's the move they have to make. Juggernaut to Doormat says weekly Friday show now. Absolutely. Chase
Let's
Senior's
go.
fantastic. We're going to try to have him on as many Fridays as we possibly can. Dazza says if Chase Young isn't healthy, he's been productive with 5 sacks. That would currently be first on the Niners and 2 more than Bosa for a third rounder. Yeah, no, I mean, it was a no doubter. You mentioned Luter Jr. So the Niners didn't get a corner in trade, but they've got 2 corners. I was there every day in camp. Womack was spectacular.
Yeah.
And I would love to see him be back and put, Lenore inside. Then the wild card here is Darrell Luter Jr. You mentioned him, 5th-round pick out of South Alabama, went on the PUP list in July with a hyperextended knee that resulted in a bone bruise. And now, Lynch said that, those guys, both Womack and Luter Jr., have had their practice windows open. So that seems to be a precursor to them returning, which would give this defense a huge lift. And I wonder if their returns maybe made the urgency to add a corner at any price. Maybe they didn't feel, as compelled to make that deal because they've got a couple in-house options. Let's get to Fred Warner and the run D for a second. Warner's on pace, Chase, to have the most missed tackles in his career. And it's the highest percentage as well. He missed 20 tackles all of last year. He's got 15 missed tackles through 8 games. Greenlaw missed 22 tackles last year. He's up to 16 already. His highest percentage of missed tackles in his career, 16.3%. He's currently missing 23.5%. And the Niners, who were are now 22nd in rushing DVOA, 26th in EPA per rush and rushing success rate. And the defense, to me, it's like if you can run on this defense, they were number 1 in the league against the run. I asked Shanahan at the end of camp at the podium, I said, how concerned are you with your run D? Your run D's getting gashed the last couple of games. And he's like, well, actually, it was really all 3. The Raiders ran it well against us as well in the first preseason game. He said, I'm not that concerned because, our numbers last year were really strong against the run. But I would contend that team had Azeez Al-Shaair. That team did not have Javon Hargrave, who's more of a rusher than a run defender. That team had Emmanuel Mosley. That team had Jimmy Ward. There's some really good run. That team had Samson Ebukam setting the edge.
Yeah.
I just think that the personnel, Hargrave, that got all of our attention, but all these really good run defenders kind of slipped out the door quietly. Nobody noticed. Now here we are in early November, and it looks like they've got a major problem stopping the run. How big of a problem is the Niner run D in your mind?
It's an issue, and when they signed Hargrave, I thought it was a really good move because I thought it was going to be able to open up Nick Bosa. And even though he won Defensive Player of the Year last year with 18.5 sacks, the last month of the season, he didn't actually register a sack. And I thought that he looked worn down a little bit. So I thought it was really important for San Francisco this offseason to bring in either another edge, and now they've done that with Chase Young at the trade deadline, or a run stuffing and pass rushing defensive tackle. Unfortunately, it's really hard to find those types of players. With Hargrave, though, I understand that last year he had 11 sacks, and that's the juicy, sexy number that everybody focuses on. But look, I cover the Philadelphia Eagles, as we talked about last week, and I had warned a lot of people, don't get too excited about those 11 sacks because he's awful against the run as a defensive tackle. He had a run defense Pro Football Focus grade of 48.2. That's awful, yet his pass rush grade last year was 90.8. And this year, we've seen their ability to stop the run be one of the lone reasons why this defense has struggled over the last couple of weeks. I'll tell you this too, and one of the reasons why I've been really frustrated with this football team, and I do believe that when we're in these types of positions, Larry, when we can serve as the voice of the fan, like at some point you have to hold the coaches and the players accountable. And what's irritated me so much is the lack of preparation. After the Cowboys lost, they got way too overconfident. Championship contending teams shouldn't have trap games. And I think that this team has walked around with its chin and its nose up, being way too overconfident, and in turn, they've gotten sloppy. And as part of that, the lack of tackling and the awful tackling has been so irritating, and it's something that has been a massive problem for this team. San Francisco missed 24 combined tackles as a team the first 5 weeks of the year. During this 3-game losing streak, they have missed 32 tackles. To me, that is absolutely unacceptable for a team that has Super Bowl aspirations, that's paying this much money and investing this much money on that defensive front, that has such a good linebacking core that when they got off to that 5-0 start, I know you noted some of the missed tackles for Fred Warner and Dre Greenlaw, but my goodness, they can wreak havoc from sideline to sideline, and it's just been lazy play. And lastly, as part of that, Fred Warner talked about this on his podcast. Kyle Shanahan talked about this earlier this week. He said, when I look back at it on tape, we look banged up, we look slow, we look tired. Fred Warner said that as well. And I think that has to do with the Niners' physicality. That has to do with them just being worn down going into the bye week. I think the bye week comes at a really good time for this team to rest up a little bit. I think there are multiple players who seem to lack that juice that they had earlier on this year. I also think it's a byproduct of this team playing, 40 games the last 2 years by making it to back-to-back NFC championship games and not making it to a Super Bowl. So you have the physical toll of having to play 40 games the last 2 years, but then the mental and emotional toll of losing in the NFC championship game in pretty heartbreaking fashion if we want to involve the human element into this. They thought they had a really good chance against Philadelphia. They were on that crazy winning streak. Brock Purdy injures his elbow because Kyle Shanahan lined up a tight end in pass protection. And then the year before that, they're up going into the fourth quarter against the Los Angeles Rams. So it's not only the physical toll that this team has had to go through, and that's why we struggle to see these organizations across the NFL, because of the physical toll of this game, be able to maintain a level of consistency like San Francisco has had. But it's also the emotional toll that I think they're worn down a little bit. Hopefully they get re-energized by the bye week. I saw Brock Purdy was harvesting out in a cornfield. I saw Deebo Samuel was hopping on a private jet to go to a beach or something, and hopefully the bye week has them refreshed and they understand the opportunity at play here, because they do have a legitimate chance to make it to the Super Bowl.
You know, it's so funny because I just put out a tweet a couple of hours ago. I'm like, is this guy for real? And like, I would say a third of the people are like, why are you ripping him? I'm like, ripping him? The guy's working for free on a farm. He's an NFL quarterback who's working probably for free on a farm to probably help some family member, or, you know, because he's, you know, got his Iowa State roots. And it's obviously, I'm not ripping him. I'm saying, is this guy for real? As far as, I mean, I wouldn't do it. You probably wouldn't do it, but there he is with his fiance out in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa, trying to lend a helping hand to somebody that probably meant something to him. I just think Brock, you know, the goodness of Brock is incredible.
Yeah. I saw Rich Madrid. He was like, what, he can't effing enjoy his bye week? I'm like, do you not understand that Larry's actually like, this guy is unbelievable. Like, it's his bye week and he's out harvesting on a cornfield on a John Deere tractor. That's incredible.
And
he's
how
so authentic.
And what kind of a miserable human being would rip that and be like,
Crazy.
He should be in the facility. He should be watching film. They're in the middle of a 3-game losing streak and this guy cares about corn. You know, it's like some people are just so wired differently. We got this one in the chat from CJ Gray, who's a great guy. He says, I forgot to mention Hassan Ridgeway. Yeah, I mean, they lost Ridgeway, Al-Shaair, Jimmy Ward, Samson Ebukam, Emmanuel Mosley. Those are 5 of their most physical run defenders. Not all those guys played full time, as you know, but still, they lost a lot on this run defense. And
How about from the 2021 team, DJ Jones and K'Wan Williams, too?
Yeah. DJ Jones, K'Wan Williams, Jaquaski Tart.
Yep.
You know, there's no question. All of those guys were awesome against the run. And Tart and Ward were almost like having additional linebackers. And those guys are playing in the safety, the defensive backfield at safety. Now you replaced them with Hufanga and Gibson. Gibson had that big hit that was penalized, but he's much more of a deep center field, you know, pick off passes kind of a guy. Hufanga doesn't seem like he's nearly as good against the run as he was under D'Amico, where he just sensed that mesh point and the timing was uncanny. So they've got some issues against the run for sure.
That's why I want to see Jair Brown on the field.
Oh, I do, because he'll blow you up. He'll hit you.
Yep.
He'll absolutely be, and he's rested. He's ready. Shanahan, you mentioned it. Shanahan said, my team looks tired. My team looks slow. The bye week's going to help the tired. How do they inject more speed?
Man, look, if we're talking defense, going back to Jair Brown, he can't be worse than Isaiah Oliver. Isaiah Oliver, again, giving up an 86% completion percentage. He has not caused an incompletion over the last 4 games. So I think that Jair Brown's a really good athlete. I know that James Franklin has never won the big game while he's been in Happy Valley at Penn State outside of 2016 when they blocked a field goal and beat Ohio State. But I will say this about Penn State. They do one of the best jobs of developing players and athletes at Penn State for the pro level. You look at the litany of players from that program who have ended up making it to the pros and being high-level impactful players. Jair Brown can be ready. So defensively, certainly that. I think Chase Young's athleticism can help this team. I think Randy Gregory's bend and athleticism can certainly help this team. If you really want to go look at that linebacker spot, I know Oren Burks grades out well as far as his Pro Football Focus grades, and he's actually been pretty good in coverage, surprisingly, because usually, historically, he's been a special teamer. How about playing a D Winters? How about playing a Jalen Graham? They are really good athletes with elite speed. We saw it flash time and time again throughout the preseason, and San Francisco's done such a good job of kind of identifying those linebackers, grooming them, develop them. Look at Aziz Al-Shire. Look at Fred Warner. Look at Dre Greenlaw. Look at a guy like Marcelino McCrary-Ball, who had that defensive background, who I was surprised didn't make the 53-man roster, where they developed him from a DB, turned him into a linebacker. D Winters and Jalen Graham, they kind of have that build to a certain degree. And then on the offensive side of the football, I'm not sure if we're ever going to see Danny Gray. He would certainly give you that vertical threat to kind of help take the top off of the defense, but I'm not sure if he's close to coming back off that collarbone. Unfortunately, San Francisco doesn't have a lot of that speed on the offensive side of the football to kind of help in that area with speed. But you know what? I know we're talking about speed here. I would switch up putting in Jordan Mason a little bit more to give you a physical element on top of the speed element for Christian McCaffrey. I think that should be something that Kyle Shanahan and this offensive coaching staff are looking at throughout the bye week. I mean, anytime the kid is on the field, he's picking up a positive play. And I think that when you have those contrasting styles of the flash of Christian McCaffrey and then the ground and pound of Jordan Mason, who will run through you and run over you. Statistically, he's been so good at picking up yards after contact. Just that change in identity, I think, is something that San Francisco needs to get back to. George Kittle this week talked about how the Niners have become a one-dimensional team. Part of the reason for that, they've fallen behind against Cleveland, they've fallen behind against Minnesota as well as Cincinnati, so they've had to throw the football coming from behind. But they have to get back to their identity of being an evenly play-called, distributed team in which they're running it and they're throwing it. Right now, they're a little bit too pass-happy, and as part of running the football, get back to taking teams' will. Get back to wearing them down throughout the course of a 60-minute ball game, physically, but also mentally. Where has this team been that looked tremendous against the Dallas Cowboys that seemed to just snatch their souls right out of their bodies in real life? I want to see the identity of this team get back to what we saw last year and in 2021, where they were very, very physical and their talent won out throughout the course of a game, but they just wore you down and they were able to win those games late.
We're visiting with Chase Sr. this morning. He's going to be joining us on Fridays, guys, and I'm loving this stream. And I'm loving this collab. Everybody follow Chase. Heck, everybody's probably already following Chase, but you do a great job over at Chat Sports, Chase. Tell people how they can go, check you out on YouTube.
Yeah, so I'll comment in the comment section here on the 49ers Report, but you just search 49ers Report right here on YouTube. We are, I think, 600 people away from 100,000 subscribers, So that'll be a pretty cool moment once we get that silver plaque from YouTube. And then I'm on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram at Chase_Senior, so you can hit me up on social media as well.
Yeah, awesome. I really enjoy your content. A couple supers I want to get to. Daza says the 49ers rely too much on Warner and Greenlaw, which I agree with. The defense seems to have struggled while Greenlaw has been out and banged up. And then hell of this, hell of that. Nice meeting you yesterday. Yeah, I parked in the city. I did a radio show in the city, come out in the garage, and hell of this, hell of that, and standing right there. He's like, Krueg, what's going on?
That's
I'm
awesome.
a big fan of the Krueg show. So hell of this, hell of that. Good to see you yesterday. And thank you for the super chat, man. I really appreciate you. And I'll tell Kev, I told Kev, my son, that you said that he looks young, but he sounds mature. So he was very, very
That's always
happy
good.
by that. Yeah, I was happy
It's
about
good
that.
to look younger as compared to older when you're a young guy.
Yeah, that's right. You look old as shit. No, I'm actually very young. Okay, couple things. One, when the Niners, they'll give you those little in the locker room moments. Shanahan talking to the team, the players talking with one another, usually at the end of a victory. When the Niners beat the Cowboys, seemed like 10 years ago. It was only 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Fred Warner's like, it's about us. It ain't about them. It's about us. And then they all came together and it's us or whatever. We often think so much. I mean, you're a Niner content creator. I'm a Niner content creator. So we're always thinking internally. How much of the last 3 weeks was about the Niners? How much of it was not about the Niners, but really the opposition? I bring that up because I was watching Inside the NFL last night, and I just get the feeling that, like, since he plays Buffalo this week, I think since he's going to beat Buffalo this week. I think last week might have been a little bit about Cincy. And that Cleveland game, I know they looked terrible against Indy. I kind of think that might have been a little bit about Cleveland's defense.
Yeah.
And maybe the Minnesota game was a little bit about the Niners, but maybe it was a little bit about, Kirk Cousins, if you don't hit him, what he can do to you in his building when he's focused and ready. Even without Jefferson, how much has the last 3 weeks been about the Niners and what they're not doing as opposed to the Browns, the Vikings, and the Bengals? And,
I think
maybe
nowadays
the rest as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think nowadays in society, like, we have this inability to not think of things in this way where multiple things can be true at one time, right? It has to be on one side of the spectrum or the other side of the spectrum. I mean, that's in everything from sports to politics to life, whatever, right?
Right.
Let's just look at this from a couple of different perspectives, because I do believe that a couple of things can be true. Unfortunately, Kirk Cousins popped his Achilles last week, but that's a Vikings team that after a slow start, they've really started to find a groove. Also, keep this in mind that Minnesota was 11-0 in one-score games in 2022. And then as we shifted gears to 2023, a trend like that is not sustainable. And to start the year, they were 0 in one-score games. Then they beat San Francisco in a one-score game. They were due at some point to win that. And that's a solid offense, right? I know they're not playing with Justin Jefferson, but Jordan Addison, really good pick. Kirk Cousins was on a heater. And I understand that primetime Kirk has struggled historically in some of those big matchups on Sunday night, Monday night, and in the NFL playoffs. He's a really solid quarterback, though, and they were desperate for a win. So the desperation level is a thing in the NFL. The week before that against Cleveland, Kyle Shanahan is 0-9 now against Jim Schwartz-led teams, right? That's a statistic I know that you were talking about. I was talking about. For whatever reason, Jim Schwartz has Kyle Shanahan's number. But also keep this in mind. I know that PJ Walker was playing. I covered him at Temple University when I went to Temple, when Matt Rule was there. And I thought that he had chances of going to the pros. He's not a good pro quarterback, right? But let's give some credit to that defense. They have Myles Garrett. They have a really good secondary with corners and safeties. Jim Schwartz is a very good defensive coordinator. Also, San Francisco historically as an organization, for whatever reason, it's one of those weird sports stats. They can't win in Minnesota. They can't win in Cleveland, right?
Yep.
So that's the Cleveland and Minnesota part of this. And then Cincinnati, they got off to a slow start too. But are we forgetting that Joe Burrow is probably the second best quarterback in the NFL, at least in my opinion? I think it's Mahomes 1. I think it's Joe Burrow number 2.
And he's healthy now.
He's healthy. He's clearly healthy. I mean, look at his ability last week to pick up yards and first downs with his legs. Him being able to stay on his feet early in that game was a momentum changer, and Eric Armstead and Nick Bosa had opportunities to sack him. Throwing the football, he's always been accurate, layering balls in there to every single window. That Cincinnati team also has some really, really good weapons at that wide receiver spot. They've made it to back-to-back AFC championship games. They were in the Super Bowl 2 years ago. In the AFC championship game last year against the Chiefs, and if it wasn't for that hit out of bounds late, they could have won that football game. So those teams and these teams that the Niners have lost to, they're quality opponents. So yes, it has to do with the opponents, right? But it also has to do with San Francisco. They've been overconfident. They've been sloppy. They've been ill-prepared. I talked a little while ago about the missed tackles. It has been an issue. 32 in the last 3 games. It can't happen. But also, Larry, this is huge too. When you turn the football over in the NFL and you lose the turnover battle, you lose between 70 and 80% of the time.
Wow.
And look at where some of these turnovers and missed field goals have happened for San Francisco. Cleveland 36, Cleveland 23, Minnesota 15, Minnesota 22, Minnesota 49, Minnesota 40, the Cincinnati 8-yard line, and the Cincinnati 26-yard line. They lost to Cleveland by a field goal. Jake Moody makes that. That's a win. They lost to the Minnesota Vikings by 5. I know that they lost to Cincinnati by 14 points, but that was a ball game late. If you're able to hit field goals or turn those drives into touchdowns in those instances, then you're able to come out with some of these wins. They've been sloppy, and they are to blame for that. And I think that they've been a little bit fraudulent in the way where if they're playing from ahead, they're very, very confident. But if they have to play from behind, they're getting exposed a little bit. I know that David Lombardi responded to my tweet about Kyle Shanahan being like 0-36 or 1-36, whatever it was, trailing by 3+ points going into the fourth quarter. I know that playing from behind in the NFL is really, really difficult to do. But when you're missing tackles and you're turning the football over, and also you've been exposed a little bit having to play from behind where your offense is taken out of whack, and in turn you become one-dimensional. All of those are reasons why San Francisco has lost 3 consecutive games. The good thing is that I do believe that all of these things are fixable. San Francisco can certainly turn this around, and I think it's good to go through this rough patch from Brock Purdy to this defense struggling, to this offense not scoring more than 20 points during this 3-game losing skid, to have this rough go right now as compared to later on in the season when you're trying to get geared up for the playoffs.
Chase Sr.'s in the house on the Krueg Show. We're brought to you by Pig and a Pickle, the best barbecue in Northern California. Check them out in Emeryville and Corte Madera. Best barbecue you're going to find. Get the brisket chili. Go say hi to Damon and Mary. Tell them that Krueg sent you. Also brought to you by Marin Auto Glass. If you shatter a windshield, you need them to come out. MarinAutoGlass.com, 415-883-3030. Underdog Fantasy, and check the link in the description, and New York style Italian sausage. All right, going into the bye, 49ers get Jacksonville coming out. Who is your offensive MVP? Who's your defensive MVP for the 49ers at this point?
Offensive MVP has to be Christian McCaffrey, and that's with him not looking great, I'd say, over the last 3 weeks. He's looked a little bit banged up, and when Kyle Shanahan talks about the team looking slow, looking tired, I think McCaffrey's been in that equation, but he's been tremendous this year, and without him, this Niners team just isn't the same offensively. So Christian McCaffrey would be my offensive MVP. Defensive MVP is tough because nobody's really played well, and they've been exposed in these last 3 games. You know, you talked about the missed tackles from Fred Warner, but I feel like every single week from a leadership standpoint, playing standpoint, he's one of the only guys who's really brought it all 8 weeks of the year. So I'm going to go Fred Warner as my defensive MVP, but I can't really pinpoint a specific name defensively because these struggles have kind of overshadowed what should be one of the league's best defenses.
You know, the two guys, and I agree with both those. I would probably go with Warner, and you got to go with CMC. CMC is, you know, I mean, he's top 5 in the MVP ballots in the NFL. You know, leads the league in rushing yardage. He's got the most receiving yards among all running backs. He's got 13 total touchdowns. He's your offensive MVP for sure. And I would go probably with Warner as well. The two guys that I'm having a hard time kind of deciding good year, bad year on are Brandon Aiyuk and Nick Bosa. It's easy to watch the film and see that Bosa commands doubles. Bosa draws penalties against him. Bosa's still very much a force. but he did have 18 and a half sacks last year, and he only has 2 right now. So if you're one of these where the sacks guys, you may be saying Nick hasn't been good. Now, John Lynch would say, hey, man, if you don't think Nick's been good, you don't know ball, and you're not watching close enough. So there's that. Then on the other side, and I got into it last night on my stream with some guys, and they said, give me your thoughts. Somebody in the chat said, what do you think of Brandon Ayuk's year? And to me, I'm disappointed in the year that he's had. And then yet, if you look at his numbers, there's some good numbers there, right? He's 10th in receiving yards. He missed a game. He's got the 10th most first downs in the league. But he also, the way Bosa's got 2 sacks, he only has 2 touchdowns. And if you had said to me, man, watching him this summer, what do you expect? I would have said, Brandon Aiyuk is going to the moon. He's going to have a career year. He's going to have 10 to 12 touchdowns. And maybe he still will. But to me, the lack of sack production from Bosa and the lack of touchdown production from Aiyuk is surprising. Give me your thoughts on those 2 guys.
Yeah. And again, like I was talking about this a little bit earlier, what's really annoyed me during this 3-game losing streak, it's the sloppiness, being ill-prepared, as I talked about, but it's these elite level players not playing up to their expectations. Now, it's crazy because when you look at Bosa's in-depth numbers, 92 overall Pro Football Focus grade, 80.5 run defense grade. I always think he's been a little bit underrated there because everybody focuses in on the sacks. That's the juicy number. A pass rush grade of 91.6. He has 279 pass rush snaps this year with 44 total pressures, 25 hurries. But the lack of sacks has certainly been a problem. What's odd is that PFF doesn't do half sacks. They do full sacks, and they have Bosa's having 4 sacks, but it really is 2.5. And he's missed out on sacks by just milliseconds. So he's been so close to finishing. And then you look at Brandon Aiyuk. Like Bosa last week, there's no excuse for him to miss those tackles in the backfield against the run. And what really bothered me is that he's the guy who addresses this team before game day. He's the highest paid non-quarterback in the history of the NFL. When you're paid that much money, you are held to a standard. And that last Joe Mixon run, had an opportunity to set the edge, had an opportunity to tack him in the backfield. He whiffed. And then he kind of flailed his arms when he looked back. He's like, what, nobody's there on that second or third level to make the tackle after me? That is not what leaders do. So he has not played up to his level of just elite level potential, right? And then for Brandon Aiyuk, got off to a really good start this year. Inexcusable to have some of the drops that he's had the last couple of weeks, especially at the end of the first half last week. You have an opportunity to really seize the momentum of that football game. Brock Purdy made that incredible throw to George Kittle down the seam, and then he throws it to Aiyuk, who had an opportunity to get the Niners into field goal range for Jake Moody. Ball clanks off his face mask. Those types of plays can't happen, and they have been happening. And that's why the Niners have been struggling so much. But you're right. Like you look at Ayuk's numbers, 109 yards week 1, 57 yards, 76, 58, 148, 43, and then 129. That was going from most recently to week 1. So that 129 was against Pittsburgh in opposite direction there. That's my B. But he has had a good season. But statistically, it's one of those things where his numbers look a little bit better than how he's been playing. So I have been a little bit disappointed in him because he's had an opportunity with Deebo Samuel out to be that number 1 guy. He has all the flash to be that number 1 guy. He has all the ability, but you just can't drop the football like he's been dropping the football from normally a guy who's very sure-handed.
And most underrated 49er. Who do you think's had an underrated good year? And this is always difficult, these underrated, overrated, because it's all based on a rating that, it's kind of like, well, what rating are you referring to? So it's kind of like your perception. But I know you're, deep on the Niners and you're, seeing all the different angles. Is there somebody that you thought, you know what? Thought he was going to be this, but he's really that. And thus I'll say, you know what? Kind of underrated.
Yeah, well, a couple of thoughts here. With how Brock Purdy has ended in the fourth quarter, the last 2 games, a lot of people think that he's been awful in the last 2 or 3 games. In the last 8 quarters, 6 of them, I think he's played tremendous football. And the Niners' recent struggles have overshadowed how well he's played this year. I actually think that you can put him in that category of being somewhat underrated. If you want to go to a position that maybe the common fan doesn't focus in on, Aaron Banks, I think he's given up 1 sack this year. The Pro Football Focus numbers aren't great, but sometimes they get too nerdy. And I know that I've alluded to them at points in this show, but sometimes you have to look at the eye test, right? He's given up 1 sack this year. I think he's been a little bit underrated. I think a lot of people panicking about George Kittle is a little bit overblown. I think that he draws very important assignments as a blocker sometimes, depending on the game plan and the matchup, where he's not always used as much in the pass game as I would like. But he looks to be every bit of the player that signed that contract extension a few years ago. So that's offense. Defense, I think Eric Armstead has historically been underrated. Again, everybody focuses in on the sacks, but he's a really impactful player. He was the only guy who got home last week with those 2 sacks against Joe Burrow. And Talanoa Hufanga fallen a little bit under the radar. He gets a little bit too over-aggressive at times and over-pursues, but I think he's been pretty solid this year. I would say Mooney Ward, I think that he can be overshadowed too, but he's been picked apart a little bit, but I think that's because of the Niners defensive line not getting home. So those are kind of the names that immediately come to mind for me.
Yeah, I think Banks is a great one. I think Lenore has been kind of underrated.
Lenore's a good one, yeah.
Lenore's been solid. Last question on Purdy. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, where are you? You kind of already kind of gave it away there where you're at with Brock, but it's kind of he's an NFL quarterback. So when they win, it's like, this guy's the best. When they lose, it's like, get him out of there. And nobody sees anything else. And it's like, they lost because of his 4th quarter turnovers. And it's like, okay. I mean, it's fair because some of those turnovers really were costly, but I think you could make an argument in this Bengals game that, man, they were only in this game in the first 3 quarters because Brock Purdy, 6 days after a concussion, was running all over the field and making plays and buying extra time and keeping up with, as you said, the second best quarterback in the game right now in Joe Burrow. So I kind of like what I've seen from Brock, even though I guess this is where I'm at. When they were beating Dallas, and I think the intellectual fan was saying, hey, you know what? This is great. They're undefeated. But come on, guys. Brock's going to throw picks. Come on, guys. The 49ers are not going to go undefeated. They're going to lose games. There's very few undefeated teams in the history of the NFL. There's very few one-loss teams in the history of the NFL. They're going to lose 2, 3 games, maybe 4, maybe more. And at the time, it was like, what? They're not going to lose that many games. And Brock, he's not going to throw all these picks. And yet it sounded very logical to say, he's going to throw picks. They're going to lose games. It's amazing how that was like, pump the brakes, everybody. This is going to happen. And then when it does happen, it's like the sky's falling. He's throwing picks. He's not the guy. He's not him, blah, blah, blah. The Niners are not going to make the playoffs, the free fall. It's amazing how we can't have any perspective over the course of a season. I fall into it. Probably you may as well. But through it all, how would you say that Brock is progressing the way you thought he would progress, let's say in training camp, factoring in, the hope for good health? He's been healthy. He's played. Is he playing about the way you thought he would play? Did you think he'd play better? Did you think he would play worse? Give me your quick thought on Brock before we.
I actually think he's played better than I thought he was going to play. And I think that Kyle Shanahan has put more trust in him as a passer than I thought he was going to. I also think during this 3-game skid, context is really important. The only game where he was like bad for a majority of the game this year was against Cleveland. But look, against that defense that we're so complimentary of, what did Brock Purdy do at the end of the game? He drove the Niners right down the field, and I thought that Kyle Shanahan, who I don't like his game management, I don't like how conservative he gets, He should have run another play or two to make that field goal a little bit easier. But what did Brock do? Drove the Niners right down the field in crunch time when he was in the pressure cooker, making some high-level throws to set up a field goal that Jake Moody should have made. And if Jake Moody makes that kick, we're talking about Brock Purdy's game-winning drive against that defense where he overcame adversity and maintained that mental fortitude that had to require stones. So context is important there. Against Minnesota, really good first 3 quarters, and to rebound off that Browns game, that was important. I will say those 2 picks that he threw in the fourth quarter, awful throws. He threw it too far inside on that ball to Jennings, and then that drive at the end of the game when they're down by 5, he's throwing across his body, and it's just a bad throw. Those are on Brock Purdy. But did those 2 picks come after he suffered a concussion on that quarterback sneak? Potentially. Was he a little bit rattled? May have been, as far as his brain goes. And then against Cincinnati, really good first 3 quarters. The opportunity that he had to really prove himself against a good defense. Everybody loves their defensive coordinator, Lou Amarillo or whatever. He's looked at as one of the best defensive minds in football. He's making improvisational plays. He's running for his life out there. He's extending plays with his legs in the pocket, but picking up first downs with his legs, coming off a concussion from 6 days ago. He's layering footballs in there to all 3 windows. A couple of the seam balls and the throws down the numbers to Kittle, to Aiyuk. Those are high-level quarterbacking throws. Again, when you're inside the 10, off that broken play that should have been a shovel, you can't throw that football. Those were the picks that Brock Purdy was throwing at Iowa State. Can't happen at the NFL level. And then the very next throw, linebacker read his eyes. He threw it right to him. Those picks are on Brock. But context is important because in 6 of the last 8 quarters, as I said, I think that he's played really good football. Things were too easy for him to start his career. 10-0 in the regular season as a starter to begin his career. Every quarterback has gone through a rough patch. Look at how Troy Aikman started his career. Look at how Peyton Manning started his career. Tom Brady has dealt with struggles. Patrick Mahomes has as well. This guy was falling for Mahomes at the start of the season a couple of years ago. The NFL is hard. There are great defensive minds. There are great players. There are great schemes. It is best, I believe, to bulletproof Brock Purdy's mind now and for him to deal with these struggles now than later in the season. And I do believe that San Francisco can turn this around. And I think it's good that Purdy has hit adversity because at some point you're going to hit it. And he's hitting it right now. And I have belief that he's going to be able to respond to it just because of the way that he carries himself. And again, what I've seen, large body of work is what you have to focus in on here. I could do 10 straight shows that are awesome. If I have one bad one, doesn't mean I'm a shitty host. Just mean I had an off day.
And if I said to you quarterback stat, what's the stat that you look at? Is it yards per attempt? Is it quarterback rating? Is it completion percentage? Because I'm looking at his numbers. He's the highest passer rating in the NFL on throws 25 plus yards down the field at 142.2. Cousins is second, Stroud's third. He's second in passer rating overall. And he's 10th in completion percentage. He's first in yards per attempt. I mean, that's pretty good for a second-year quarterback. I would say that's and for a guy who a lot of people thought, hey, man, he's not even going to play the first 6 weeks of the year, coming off the elbow. Other people projecting sophomore slump. People projecting he couldn't get any better. To be first in yards per attempt, second in passer rating, first in quarterback in passer rating on passes 25 yards down the field, 10th in completion percentage. I'm pretty satisfied with those numbers, to be completely honest.
Pretty damn good. And you look at how he's playing as compared to how Jimmy Garoppolo is playing with the Las Vegas Raiders. He's benched going into November. And Purdy statistically has been one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. So this Jacksonville game is huge.
Yeah.
If he struggles again, they're not going to bench him, right? Like, you have to be able to give him a leash so that he can battle through some of these things. But if you lose that Jacksonville game, I think a team as a whole from a macro standpoint things start to get a little bit tight at 5-4. I think Seattle's a really good team. You play them 2 times in 3 weeks with the Eagles game sandwiched in there. You got to beat Jacksonville. And if they're able to do that, I think we're going to forget about a lot of these struggles over the last 3 games.
Chase, great stuff. One last super to read here from Daza. He says, how do we go from CMC being a piece to put us over the top to him being most of our offense? Well, you got injuries to Debo. You've got, really, I mean, it's Kittle's, I think, was a little dinged up coming out of camp. Aiyuk's had a great year yardage wise, not a great year touchdown wise. And, and there's a lot of football to be played. I mean, that's the other part of this. Chase, great stuff, man. What do you got planned the rest of the day? Where you popping on Chat Sports? Are we going to see you later today, or what's your day looking like?
Yeah, today's my off day, so I ran a bunch of errands today. I'm based in Dallas, so the Texas Rangers parade is going on right now.
Nice.
I didn't really have much of a want to go, but I might meet up with some friends who were there just to kind of end the Friday and get the good vibes going. So that's kind of what I have in store for today. I already pushed out a video on the Niners report, another one to come a little bit later. Earlier, I looked at free agent targets, and then a little bit later on, some of the bye week changes that I think San Francisco has to make.
Great stuff. Thanks to our sponsors once again: New York Style Italian Sausage, Underdog Fantasy, Marin Auto Glass, and of course the title sponsor of the Krueg Show, Pig in a Pickle. Next time you get out here to the Bay, we're going to take you out for a little Pig in a Pickle barbecue, man.
Hell yeah, I'm down. Let's go.
We'll do it. Thanks, Chase. Have a great Friday. Thanks to all you guys. Catch me on the radio at 2:00 on 95.7 The Game.
Yeah, never met a man I've been scared.